So the article that you're looking at, Infrastructure and the Integral State, emerged out of some empirical reading that I was doing around American national security policy, American education policy, and the politics of critical infrastructure. And in the course of doing that reading, and particularly reading contemporary policy documents, I was really struck by the fact that private sector actors play a very prominent role in providing national security education across the American educational spectrum. Right? So we're talking, from kindergarten to grade 12 and beyond. Private sector actors play a very prominent role in devising curriculum and in trying to educate American citizens into particular ways of being in order to protect critical infrastructures. And so in the course of doing some of that reading, I was prompted to try and understand or try and dig deeper into different theoretical approaches that we could use to explain what I was looking at. And so in the course of doing that, I went back and I read some of the more recent literature on the relationship between infrastructure and state formation, with a particular focus on Bruno Latour's actor network theory. And I found Latour's work was really quite helpful as a prompt to try and think through that relationship between infrastructure and state formation, and in emphasizing the centrality of materially building out the state to create the state as a particular kind of effect, the centrality of that relationship between humans and non-humans in making political communities. But what I found in the course of doing some of that reading of Latour's work is that Latour really embraces a kind of external-relational ontology. So that is any kind of assemblage that he's tracing out and telling us how the state gets created as an effect. All of the different actants within the assemblage are treated as always already separate. And so the attempt there for Latour is to say, okay, if these actors are always already separate, how is it that they come to be related to each other? And in looking at that, I found it a little bit difficult to try and conceptualize how we could talk about the relationship between private sector actors and public sector actors. Because to me anyways, these are not always already separate actors. The institutional separation between the public sector and the private sector is a kind of historical product. And so what I wanted to understand is, are there other approaches out there that might enable me to think about the politics of infrastructure and state formation while still being able to kind of chart out how public sector actors, private sector actors, civil society, and the state are internally related to each other as parts of a larger social formation in the process of making and creating an infrastructural state. And so that's where I turn to Gramscian state theory to do this, and particularly to the concept of the integral state. So one of the things I found quite helpful about engaging with Gramscian state theory was precisely this notion of its internal relations. So it takes an approach to internal relations which emphasizes not just the fact that the private sector and the public sector infrastructure are internally related to each other as parts of a larger social formation, but also the fact that there's an internal relationship between past, present, and future forms of the state. And so in that sense, when we think about the politics of infrastructure and how infrastructures get made and how, for example, civil defense education takes place around critical infrastructures, we need to be able to conceptualize the historical legacies that inform the different ways in which the politics of infrastructure play out in different countries and at different kinds of institutional sites. And so that's where I take some of those ideas, and particularly the notion of the strategic selectivity of the state from Gramscian state theory, and deploy them in the last part of the article to look at civil defense education in the early Cold War period in the United States. What's interesting, again, about civil defense education in the early Cold War period in the US is it looks very different from civil defense education in other countries. And part of the reason for this is, again, the prominence of private sector actors. So because of that historical legacy of the way in which education is fractured by American federalism, that is, the American government can't create any kind of national curriculum in the same way in which you could create a national curriculum in the United Kingdom. And due to, of course, American anti-statist traditions, the American state can't simply force American citizens to go through processes of civil defense education as they could in the Soviet Union. How is it that the United States could develop forms of civil defense education and inculcate American citizens with particular kinds of national security practices that allowed it to maintain a nuclear weapons-based national security strategy and thus maintain a kind of way in which I would call it is an American nuclear weapons state, in which a particular kind of state and a particular kind of nuclear weapons infrastructure become fused together in one larger social totality. And so what I found there was, again, this historical legacy of the fracturing of education and the national government's prerogative over education to the state level in American society really meant that the private sector and civil society actors played a much more significant role in creating the infrastructural and the nuclear weapons infrastructural state than in other countries. And so in the American context, what you see, for example, is that, Betty Crocker cookbooks, for example, become an important avenue through which national defense education is disseminated to the American public. And so what we find there is not that the public sector and the private sector and cookbooks are all externally related to each other. Rather, they're all internally related to each other in the production of a larger social totality. So that temporal legacy, that historical legacy of American educational policy became very important in the development of civil defense education and thus infrastructural state formation in the immediate American Cold War period. What does this mean in larger theoretical terms? Well, I think if we think about the relationship between infrastructure and state formation in this way as being always a process, an internally related process between past, present, and future infrastructural state forms, it allows us to think through how the contemporary infrastructural state forms that we see around us may develop into the future. And so that can allow, for example, critical theorists in international relations to get a better handle on how our contemporary states and our contemporary infrastructural state forms may develop into the future, and the way in which we can practically enact different kinds of change based on those potentialities to realize different kinds of future socio-technical orders. So in a nutshell, I think that's roughly what the paper is trying to do.